Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Drs. Quincy Law and Jon Trappe about greenhouse gas emissions from turfgrass. When you think of greenhouse gas emissions, you may think of traffic jams, factories, or even your own personal carbon footprint. One source you might not consider, however, is the grass growing beneath your feet. Grasses both produce and absorb greenhouse gases as part of their natural day-to-day lives, but it's possible that proper management and grass selection can reduce or even balance these exchanges. This episode, Quincy and Jon discuss which management practices and grass species can best help balance the scales. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we want to thank our sponsors, starting with Gazmat Technologies, the maker of the GT5000 Terra, the smallest portable FTIR multi-gas analyzer for greenhouse gas and environmental research. Measure carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, nitrous oxide, nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide, ammonia, and water vapor in real time simultaneously from static or automated chambers. Visit www.gazmat.com, that's Gazmat spelled G-A-S-M-E-T, or email sales@gazmat.com for more information. Our second sponsor is Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show today. Today we have Quincy and Jon with us. Quincy picked up golf at the age of 7 and began working on a golf course at age 16, which led to majoring in turfgrass management at Iowa State University. He worked for Dr. Nick Christians while he was an undergraduate at ISU, who introduced him to turfgrass research as well as graduate school. He then attended Purdue University for both his master's and PhD, studying under Dr. Aaron Patton. It was at Purdue that he worked with Jon Trappe on the research we're discussing today, and he is now an assistant professor of noxious and invasive weeds at North Dakota State University. Jon became interested in turf by working at golf courses as well to get free golf and immediately loved learning about turf management. This led him to Purdue for his bachelor's in turf, where he also met Dr. Aaron Patton. The initial interest in turf took him further into the rabbit hole of turf science for his master's and PhD, for a better understanding of the hows and whys. It was in his PhD and this research project that he centered his focus on soil health, which led him to where he is today. Hello, Quincy and Jon. How are you both doing today?
I'm good. How are you, Abby?
Oh, I'm doing all right. Battling a bit of a cold, but I'm okay.
Hopefully you feel better, Abby.
Thank you.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having us.
Oh, we're so glad to have you on. Thank you for being on. We'll jump right in here then. So today we are talking about turf grasses and greenhouse gases. So to get started, why don't we talk a little bit about the different kinds of gases that you were studying and how they typically enter into the environment?
So we were studying 3 specific greenhouse gases. Most people are familiar with carbon dioxide, and that receives a lot of attention. However, there are other greenhouse gases of concern, especially in plant production, and those include nitrous oxide as well as methane. And so while carbon dioxide, or CO2, receives a lot of the attention, these other greenhouse gases can have more of an impact on a molecular level. And so that's why we studied those in addition to CO2.
Okay. And you did 2 experiments here. So can you tell me more about the 2 different experiments you conducted and what you were hoping to study with each?
Sure. So, and just to kind of build off of what Quincy had said in the lead up to describing what these greenhouse gases are. So they're naturally occurring in the environment regardless of the plant type or crop grown. And so, and what we were trying to basically get at is to better understand, okay, what role do these does an individual turfgrass species affect this, but also potentially any management practices related to growing and taking care of those turfgrasses on how those might influence those greenhouse gas emissions. So our project focused on two broad experiments, and my experiment we'll just call experiment one, and then I'll let Quincy kind of get into what his experiment was looking at. But my experiment was really just largely focused on trying to better understand the effect of a turfgrass species would have on those three greenhouse gas emissions: the carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. So so we were conducting this experiment in both of these experiments in West Lafayette, Indiana, which is currently in the transition zone, and so that's kind of a unique spot because it's where we have both what we in the turfgrass industry called cool and warm season turfgrasses, where those are both actively growing and heating with one another, and they're used on golf courses, athletic fields, home lawns, anywhere where turf is grown. So in that, and it's a very unique environment because it allows for both of those types of turfgrass species. Their cool season grasses are considered to have a C3 photosynthetic pathway, meaning that when in describing their physiology, whereas the warm season grasses are C4 plants that have a different physiology, and effectively the way you can kind of think of them is that the warm season grasses grow much more readily in the warmer temperatures, and the cool season grasses grow much more readily in the cooler temperatures. And for the sake of this experiment, the three turfgrass species that I used that were cool season grasses were Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, and perennial ryegrass, and then the two warm season grasses were zoysia grass and Bermuda grass.
And whereas mine, we will call experiment 2, was a little more focused within the cool season grasses. So I had 2 species, and then within each of those 2 species, I had 3 cultivars. And we selected each of those cultivars based on how fast they grow. And so for each species, which I had Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue, I had a slow, a moderate, and a fast-growing cultivar. And then in addition to looking at the growth rates, we also looked at some specific management practices. And for this experiment, that was whether we collected or returned the grass clippings. And so that has some potential impact in that there is some carbon and nitrogen in those grass clippings that you would either be removing or mulching back into the turf. And so as a result, that may have some impact on the greenhouse gas flux. And so that was the kind of the 2 areas that my experiment investigated.
Okay. And for this clipping management, is the idea that because these nutrients would then be returned to the soil, it could potentially lead to more gas creation? Or is it because it's kind of fostering some kind of semi-composty environment, and that's where the gases are coming from?
Yeah, I'd say a little bit of both in the sense of your question. So when we return those clippings, soil microbes will break them down and then return those to the soil. When we collect those clippings, it just depends where we end up placing them in terms of what happens to those nutrients within the clippings.
All right. Okay, so we've got basically testing to see if there are certain species of turf grasses that are going to foster more gas creation to start. And then the second experiment is more about how you treat the grasses themselves. So after doing your research, what did you find?
Well, for my experiment that was really looking at, just looking at the differences of species, we found that those greenhouse gas fluxes really does vary by species. And so just to kind of get a little bit into the details of this experiment. So we were effectively trying to look at how these greenhouse gas emissions varied by season as well. And so we wanted to see, because we knew that the plants where we have cool season and warm season turf grasses growing, and they have their own preferences for which time of the season they're going to grow most efficiently. We wanted to look at that across the season as well. So I was collecting greenhouse gas flux rates on a monthly basis across 2 different years for a total of 14 sampling dates, and during the growing season, essentially. And we were trying to better understand how carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane were varying across season and then across those turfgrass species. And we found that on most dates, there were significant differences between those turfgrass species, which turfgrass species was grown in the area. And so it's highly variable based off of the season, but in general, we found that the C3 plants had higher CO2 flux rates than the C4 plants did. We also found some species differences for nitrous oxide and methane emissions. But in general, there was a trend where the C3 plants, the cool season plants, kind of grouped together, and the warm season plants were grouped together in how they were separated out. And in general, the C3 plants ended up having higher carbon dioxide flux rates than the C4 plants.
Okay, I want to camp out here for a little bit because I have some extra questions. So, first of all, in this transition zone, is it more that you're going to be planting them alongside, or are you planting one type of grass in summer and then you kind of start to, transition to another grass? How does all of that work, just to get started there?
Sure. So these are all perennial stands, and most turfgrass stands are perennial stands, meaning that they're planted once and then, until they need to be replanted or for whatever reason, they're generally in the ground for years to decades. So they're permanent stands, and this is largely a decision that, say, a new homeowner who has a home that's built on a new site, and they're going to establish a lawn. We were trying to answer that question. Okay, which lawn would be best in terms of their contribution or depletion of greenhouse gases to the environment?
Okay, so then second question is, if somebody already has this grass planted, I imagine that it would be easy to be like, oh, we need to just rip it up and replace it. But obviously there are pros and cons to any kind of grass that you're going to have planted. What are some of the other factors that people would consider as far as planting which grass where, besides just temperature or greenhouse gas emissions? And then what would you suggest if someone was like, I already have all this grass of one kind? Would you just be like, well, just leave it because it's not worth it? Or, what are some of these factors in these decisions?
I can jump on this one, John. So an interesting concept here is the grass itself. And so if say a homeowner is considering removing their current lawn and reestablishing a new lawn, they may actually lose a little bit of the carbon that's been sequestered in their lawn just in that transition process. And so an important part of trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases emitted is also we need to try to maximize the amount of carbon that we retain in the soil. And so by renovating the lawn, if that includes some type of tillage, you're going to lose a portion of that carbon that you don't mean to in that renovation process. So there's a lot of dynamic factors here involved with this idea of reducing greenhouse gases and then also maximizing carbon sequestration. And so while you may be attempting to reduce your long-term carbon losses, in that short term to renovate to a different grass, you may actually cause some impact there as well. And so it's important to look at the entire picture and not just one portion of it.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely a balancing act, it seems like. So thank you for researching what all goes on the scales here. I have one other question for Jon before we move on to your results, Quincy, which is, you mentioned that there were large fluxes based on when the measurements were taken throughout the season. So what were some of the factors, if any, that you were able to identify as factors that might increase or decrease flux?
Yeah, so there are some factors that we were able to separate out from my experiment and to be able to identify. And we did notice a pattern with nitrogen applications, with when those were timed, with when we saw nitrous oxide emissions increase, and that we saw those flux rates increase. And those those fertilizer recommendations were based off of what we would normally recommend a home lawn to be fertilized at. And so we tried timing our management with how these different turfgrass species were maintained exactly to how we as turfgrass scientists would recommend that any homeowner might maintain them. So we tried to look at as much of a real world scenario as possible. And then, so we did see things that have been observed in numerous other studies where nitrogen rates are affecting and positively related to nitrous oxide emissions. So as you immediately follow a fertilizer application, it's generally accepted that you're probably going to get some nitrous oxide emissions coming from that fertilizer practice, or coming from the organisms themselves that are already in the soil, how they're responding to that fertilizer practice.
Okay. So it wasn't like, oh, it was hot today or it was rainy today. It was more the fertilizer?
Oh, no, that's a great question. So there are actually other aspects as well. So we did look at soil moisture and then soil temperature. And generally speaking, like the CO2 flux rates, for example, were much more closely related to soil temperature. And with how this experiment was conducted, which is using a vented flux chamber, we are effectively measuring the respiration from both soil organisms and the plants themselves. And so it's difficult to tease out which one is which. It's a limitation of this procedure, but in general, we care about the whole system in general, and there are some experiments that it's important to separate out those, but we're looking at how these behave in the field in real world conditions. And so we did see that there was a positive relationship between soil temperature. So as soil temperature increased, we saw an increase in carbon dioxide emissions, and soil moisture was very limited, had very limited relationship between those two, even though soil moisture we do know can play, based off of other previous data that's been published, can have an impact on things like CO2 flux rates, N2O, which is nitrous oxide, and even methane, CH4. So soil moisture and soil temperature can have an impact. We saw that soil temperature had more of an impact on these flux rates than moisture.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Quincy and Jon's paper, Greenhouse Gas Fluxes from Turfgrass Systems, Species, Growth Rate, Clipping Management, and Environmental Effects, published in the Journal of Environmental Quality, will be free to read for the next 2 weeks. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsors, Gasmet Technologies and Meter Group. For Gasmet Technologies, conduct greenhouse gas flux measurements in the field using the GT5000 Terra. Weighing 20.7 pounds, splash-proof IP54 rated, internal pump and battery, and vibration resistant, the GT5000 Terra is a robust and portable multi-gas analyzer for fieldwork. Visit www.gasmet.com or email sales@gasmet.com for more information. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Okay. And did you find that those flux rates were impacted more in one type of grass than another? For example, were the cool season grasses that tend to do better in cooler temperatures more impacted by temperature, or was it just kind of across the board there was an increase when it was hot, or...
So the relationship that we did see between soil temperature and increase in carbon dioxide flux emissions, for example, it was more closely related to that time of year. So in the case of the C3 grasses, those are the cool season grasses. They're most actively growing in the late spring and early fall throughout the rest of the fall. They're more actively growing during that time frame. So those plants are exuding root exudates into the soil. They're also they're having leaves that are dying off, and those organisms that are also in the soil, those are consuming those inputs coming from the plants that are actively growing at that time frame. So it's to be expected that you would see higher CO2 flux rates anytime a plant is actively growing. So the cool season plants have much higher CO2 flux rates in the spring and fall. And conversely, the C4 plants, those are going to have, the warm season grasses are going to have higher flux rates in the summer months when they're actively growing.
Oh, okay. That makes sense to me. Thank you. The turfgrass amateur right here. So great. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So then, Quincy, what did you find in your experiment?
So similar to what Jon found, we did see some differences between turfgrass species. So in terms of carbon dioxide flux, we saw that tall fescue had a higher CO2 flux than Kentucky bluegrass. Within growth rates, we saw that the faster growing cultivars had a higher CO2 flux than the slower growing cultivars. And I think this gets back to a point that Jon had previously made, in that the faster these plants grow, the more photosynthesis they are conducting and the more CO2 they were releasing as a result of that. And so it could just be that we're seeing more CO2 release just because they are growing faster. In a related study, we found that tall fescue actually put more carbon into the soil than Kentucky bluegrass. And so it could also be that the soil microbial activity is higher in those higher input grasses than the other ones. And so it's very difficult to really explain what these differences are, but that's what we saw in terms of the species and growth rates. We did see one minor CO2 flux difference when returning grass clippings had a greater carbon dioxide flux than when clippings were removed. However, this was only after 2 years of collecting versus returning grass clippings. And so maybe over a longer time scale, we would actually see more differences between those two management practices. As far as nitrous oxide, on one of my sampling dates, we saw that the fast-growing cultivar had a higher nitrous oxide flux than the slow-growing cultivar. And so we're not exactly sure what may have caused that, but again, it may just be a nitrogen content versus concentration in those different cultivars. And the moderate cultivar kind of fell between the fast and the slow growing in that realm. And then while Jon saw a few differences in methane, we didn't actually see any methane differences in my part of the experiment. And so there was no net methane flux in either an emission or a consumption standpoint of my part of the experiment.
Okay. What, if you had to just hypothesize, would make that difference with the methane between the two experiments, I mean?
Yeah, I can try to field this one, since I did actually see just some overall species effects where we did observe some differences in species for their methane production. And quite honestly, we don't have an answer for that. That's something that is that we acknowledged in the paper, that this is something that needs more exploration in both controlled environments and in field conditions. And quite honestly, it's something that really just needs more investigation.
Okay, sure. And then I had an additional question for you, Quincy, about the different growth rates. So in my mind, it would make sense to usually want a slower growing grass anyway, because then you have to mow your lawn less. But obviously there must be reasons why the faster ones exist. So can you talk to me a little bit from like a turfgrass management perspective of why people might choose different growing speed grasses for their location?
Yeah, excellent question. And you're starting to scratch into the kind of one of the overarching goals of this project and my master's thesis in general, and that is, can we find a grass that has the best net carbon balance, in that we minimize our emissions through greenhouse gas, as well as greenhouse gas emissions in term related to fertilization and mowing, and then maximize the amount of carbon that's sequestered into the soil. And so on one hand, like you said, a slow growing grass will need to be mown less often, and based on this research, it'll have a lower greenhouse gas flux. However, what we found when we sampled the soil and did some soil carbon analysis was that the faster growing species put more carbon into the soil. That's because they're growing faster and they're pulling more CO2 from the atmosphere, incorporating that into plant tissue, and then depositing that into the soil. Now, in say a sports field management scenario, you may be more inclined to plant a faster growing cultivar, because that is directly related to its recuperative potential. So after, say, a football game that your field has been worn down, those faster growing cultivars will be able to repair themselves more quickly than the slower growing cultivars. And then in addition to that, this one of the slow growing cultivars from my experiment, it took a really long time to establish. And so you had a slow growing, really patchy turf with maybe a lot of weeds, because the grass just couldn't outcompete the weeds, whereas those faster growing cultivars, are going to be able to fill in quicker and provide a more competitive ability against some of those invasive weeds there.
Okay. So these are generally used in mixes then, where you might have a little bit of column A, column B, and maybe it varies, because I think most people, when they think of a golf course, will be like, oh, you have your like putting green grass, and then you have other, types of grass, so maybe that's different than a football field or something. But are these typically used in tandem then, or one or the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you look at a seed label on say a grass seed mix at your local hardware store, you'll see a lot of different, not just cultivars, but also species. And some of those less expensive mixes, you may get some more annual type grasses that are in there just to germinate quick, establish, and it may not be a long-term thing. But on the more expensive mixes, those are likely to be higher quality grasses. The real issue is it's difficult to find data on growth rate of grasses. So that's going to be difficult for, your average homeowner to select a grass based on its growth rate. And actually, it was my advisor, Dr. Patton, that found, these slow growing cultivars, and he was, he had to do some digging, even as an expert, in identifying what were slow, moderate, and fast growing cultivars. And within species, it can even get more complex. So the difference between the slow-growing Kentucky bluegrass and the fast-growing Kentucky bluegrass was a lot wider than the slow-growing tall fescue and the fast-growing tall fescue. So there is some caveats there in finding these grasses and picking them. And so I know that doesn't quite answer your question, but there's not a lot of data out there on what grasses grow fast and what grasses grow slow, other than at that species level. So within a species, when you're looking at the different cultivars, it can be more difficult to find fast versus slow growing cultivars unless they're specifically marketed as that. So there has been a small movement to starting to plant some of these slower growing cultivars with the idea that you'll need to mow it less often. And so unless they're marketing it as a slower growing cultivar, it can be difficult to find them.
Sure. No, I think that answers my question beautifully. Okay, yeah. Well, so we've talked about the results that you found, and also a lot of extra questions that I threw at you. And we've also touched a little bit on future research, but I would like to ask that as its own full question now. So what are the areas of future research? Where are we headed with this?
I think, Quincy touched on this a little bit when he was talking about the different management practices versus with quick and slow growing cultivars. So that's one aspect, is looking at the total amounts of maintenance required for these grasses, and then understanding, okay, what is the total flux rate for this system? Is it a net negative or net positive carbon or nitrogen system? And so it's really just better understanding that entire system. And then we basically parse those out through research, and we should be getting into specific management practices and specific behavior of the people maintaining these areas. So one aspect in particular is really getting at understanding the amount of maintenance that the average homeowner is doing, for example. So right now there's been some work that's really kind of gone at this, but they've quite frankly done a pretty poor job of understanding how the average homeowner is fertilizing their lawn, for example, how often and how much fertilizer are they actually putting on. And we're trying to answer these types of questions in a research setting, but understanding how they are in much broader terms and what they mean at the let's say the state or national level is hugely important, and is obviously going to have implications for future land management decisions. And so it's very important to understand not only how are things performing, or what are we seeing in controlled environment and research situations, but broader, how is the consumer or homeowner or turf professional maintaining these, and what impacts are those having on the broader environment?
So I would like to see more research in a long-term scale. So a lot of these projects are 2 to 5 year experiments. They're trying to do their best to learn as much as we can in that short period, but there is value in longer term experiments. And so really trying to figure out how long these soils take before they hit an equilibrium, and at a point where they are sequestering as much carbon as they are emitting. And so we need to try to figure out how to extend that equilibrium period, and then once we do hit an equilibrium, how to minimize the amount of gases that we emit and try to maintain that soil as a sink of greenhouse gases.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds like some really important future research to investigate. And thank you for doing all the work you've already done. I have 3 questions left for you. First one is if people want to learn more about any of this research or any of the things that we've talked about today, where can they go to learn more?
So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a good place to start. Within that, or IPCC for short, within that there are a number of different publications, just depending on how long of a report you want to read, essentially. And so the sixth assessment, it was recently released, or will be released here shortly, and I think that's a great place to look. That's, given that it's intergovernmental, it's a lot of different people presenting their research there. It's kind of a good meta-analysis of what's been done since the last IPCC report. So that's where I would first point people into looking at not just greenhouse gases, but also carbon sequestration and kind of that whole picture approach.
Okay, great. That sounds like a wonderful resource to get more information. Second question is, if people want to then take that next step and get involved in this kind of research, what can they do?
So graduate school would be a good area to get into this research, or as an undergraduate, but I understand that a lot of the audience here may not be in a position to do that. So in terms of contributions from a research standpoint, that can be difficult. In terms of, trying to minimize your own carbon footprint, I think just learning where carbon emissions come from is important, and then trying to avoid those products or processes. And so one good example, I guess, would be plastic. Trying to avoid single-use plastics, just knowing how much carbon is emitted in creating those items. And so that's one way. But in the terms of the research we did, I'm sure there's a lot of people that just really had no idea that there is this biogeochemical cycling going on in their own home lawn. And so just being a little more informed and understanding what goes into the carbon and nitrogen cycles would help you understand how to reduce and how to maximize sequestration in that sense. And so just knowing that, every time you fire up a gasoline-powered lawnmower, that you are emitting a little bit of carbon dioxide. And so rather than mowing your lawn every Saturday, maybe you only mow your lawn when it absolutely needs it. Within the turf science community, we often call that mowing by the 1/3 rule. And so you mow your lawn such that you only remove 1/3 of the grass blades in a single mowing event. And we actually did a little bit of research in this area and found that you can significantly reduce the number of mowing events in a growing season by mowing based on the 1/3 rule versus mowing every week. And so I know it's difficult, especially with people working a Monday through Friday job, to mow when the grass needs it, but that is one way that your everyday person can help improve their carbon balance of their lawn, is simply mow it when it needs it, not every Saturday.
Just to build off of what Quincy had said, I think there's turf grass is around us everywhere. Okay, and similarly, there's a lot of people who are impacted by turf grass, and not just by using it for recreation or for its aesthetic value around a house for landscaping or in a pretty park somewhere. So turf grasses have an importance where it's both a utility and it has some aesthetic value. And even if you are just a homeowner, or you like to take walks in the park, I think it's just better. I think it's just a great idea to understand and appreciate of the value that those things bring to us, and understanding the impact, of course, for the management of those is certainly important. But even if your exposure to turf grasses is just walking through a park, for example, I think that's helpful for understanding and appreciating what's going on at the biological level. But even if you are a scientist in the social sciences, or you're an economics specialist, or something of that nature that's fairly specific, there's a lot that we don't understand about, like I said earlier, about consumer behavior, and then understanding how individual management practices are affecting that. So if you're a scientist, I would certainly recommend at any level, if this is something that's interesting to you, is to get involved, reach out to turfgrass scientists, reach out to agronomists, and because there's a lot of intercollegiality that could really benefit both consumer behavior, but also the broader sciences in general. And there's a lot of really unanswered questions that we have about this. And I think I think you don't have to be a turfgrass scientist to appreciate those turf grasses, but then to also just better understand them. And there's aspects beyond just the biological that are important.
Yeah, totally. That is some great advice. Get involved if you can and want to, people out there. I have one question left for you. Final question here. What is one fun fact that listeners would not know about you if all they had was your research?
So, John and I are actually pretty good friends outside of work. So we met at Purdue in graduate school together, but now that I've relocated to Fargo and he's in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, we like to meet up on weekends and go fishing. We both obviously are also passionate golfers, and so it was interesting to be colleagues first, but then kind of develop a friendship on the side, and there were a lot of conversations in the lab that John and I had that I still reminisce on and think about on the positive impact that a lab mate can have on you outside of the actual work. And so I will also say that going fishing with John, it's always great, especially when I catch more than him.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah, so just Quincy is the near ironic part is that during graduate school, he really didn't fish very much, and as many times as I invited him, he certainly has been making up for it lately. But at least during graduate school, maybe that means he was a better student than I was. I'm not quite sure.
Well, wow, those are some great fun facts. I'm so glad that you guys are both friends. I won't ask about the golf scores. But thank you so much for being on. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for the work that you do and for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Abby. And also thanks for, hosting this podcast. I think it's really important to get word out on some of the research that's going on in the tri-societies. And so I thank you for your work as well.
Yeah, Abby, thank you very much for the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find links to today's resources in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Stitcher, or anywhere else you find your podcasts if you like our show. This podcast is a joint production of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by guests are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.